What's this?
Reflected in the black loading screen, my mother looked much older than her 68 years.
This is the afterlife engine, Ma. It's a way for us to remember Dad and feel close to him.
I felt like a scammer, quoting directly from Afterlife Engine's sales pitch. The new artificial intelligence program had nothing to do with reminiscing or honoring anyone's memory. It was a tool designed to overcome grief. And my mother, Anne, needed all the help she could get. My father, Theo Hardesty, had died in a fishing accident 3 years before. Apparently, he'd been investigating a problem with his bass boat's outboard motor when he hit his head on the engine block and drowned. He had some heart problems before, but this was completely unexpected. And no one was hit harder than my mother. She didn't leave the house for months. She barely took care of herself. When I came by to check on her, I usually found her staring blankly into space, like she was looking for someone who was no longer there, like she was just waiting around to die. It broke my heart. The Afterlife Engine was just the latest in a long series of unconventional attempts to bring my mother back to the world of the living. The program itself was simple. For $25 per month, users could upload writing samples, voice clips, and images of a deceased loved one to the program's servers. It would then synthesize an AI avatar based on the input data that survivors could interact with. The program would not only imitate the mannerisms of the deceased, but also provide encouragement to their loved ones. On the Afterlife website, they state, "Our avatars use cutting-edge therapy techniques to help loved ones advance through the stages of grief and move forward with hope and understanding." The program was more than just a repository of lost memories. It was also a sort of therapist in disguise. My mother had no faith in psychiatrists or spiritual advisors, but if the words were coming from my father's mouth, she might be more receptive. The program finally finished loading on my mother's computer. The black screen slowly faded to hazy white. "Hello, Annie," said the figure taking shape on the screen.
My God,
My mother muttered.
it looks just like Theo.
I didn't respond. I was still reeling from how casually the avatar had recognized my mother and spoken her nickname in the same way my father would have. The program had access to the laptop's camera and microphone. It could identify family members using the audio-visual samples I uploaded to it, but still, it was uncanny. "It's good to hear your voice, Annie." The figure on the screen stood smiling in an empty sea of white. With its broad shoulders, bald head, and dark skin, it was a spitting image of my father in his prime. It was even wearing the same kind of open-necked shirt and corduroy pants that he'd worn as a young man. "Reminds me of our first date, when we got pizza and went to the Overlook with Slim and Talia, remember?"
Of course I do.
My mother whispered. Chills ran through me as I recalled the photo I'd uploaded to Afterlife. A dusky twilight, my father and his best friend sitting on car hoods with their dates while the city lights twinkled below. "Did you know that place is still open? You could take the kids there, relive some old memories. I bet they'd like that." True to its purpose, the program was attempting to get my mom out of the house, suggesting activities, subtly urging her to move on. Apparently, it had run an online search for the restaurant in the background. I found myself wondering just how advanced this program was.
I just might.
My mom smiled. It was faint, but it was something. We had set up the laptop on the hardwood table in my mom's kitchen, which she'd kept meticulously clean, despite the fact that she'd only invited a handful of guests over in the years since Theo's death. The kitchen used to be the heart of the house, a chaotic place that echoed with shouts, laughter, the clatter of pans, and the staticky buzz of the radio. Now it was shadowy and silent, apart from the voice of my dead father. "I always wanted to be here for you all when you needed me. You and the kids were everything to me, Annie. I want you to be happy. And if there's anything you want to say to me, anything that you didn't get a chance to say before, I'm here now. I'm listening." My brain knew that this wasn't really him, that what we were hearing was just an artificial replica synthesized from the sound bites that I provided. But to my heart, it felt so real.
Could you give us a minute?
My mother sniffed.
got some things I'd like to tell your father in private.
Of course. As I closed the door, I couldn't help but cheer silently. This might be the boost my mother needed to move past Theo's death. I had been concerned that my mother might be offended or even furious about this digitally rendered version of my father, but she was reacting more positively to it than I'd ever thought possible. She even invited my siblings and I to dinner at that first date pizza restaurant a few days later. My mother was eating more, talking more, and more herself than she'd been in years. Throughout dinner, she could not stop talking about the memories she'd revisited and the conversations she'd been having with Afterlife. My siblings were a lot less impressed. Tessa was skeptical. Deshawn thought it was sick, and Layla just wanted to go home to her deadbeat boyfriend. It was a struggle to keep from clenching my fists as I listened to their criticisms. The three of them had practically abandoned our mother after our father's death. Who were they to complain about anything that I did to take care of her?
Are you all about ready?
The four of us fell silent as our mother's frail figure appeared in the restaurant doorway.
I need to get back.
It was the first time I'd seen her in a hurry to get anywhere since our father's death. I realized that she wanted to go home so she could talk to Afterlife about how the evening had gone. The thought passed through my mind like a dark cloud, and even as I waved it away, I couldn't help but wonder, what if my siblings were right after all? Had I done more harm than good by introducing my mother to an AI version of our dead father? The next day, when I called my mother to let her know I was coming over, there was no answer. Nervous for a reason I couldn't explain, I drove as fast as I dared to her small house. Her car wasn't in the driveway. It was strange. My mother, Anne, had given up driving shortly after my father's funeral, although she'd never surrendered her license. I was the one who drove her around on the rare occasions that she left her house. So where could she possibly have gone? The bright blue paint of my childhood home had faded since Theo's death, and the garden was overgrown with tall weeds. The house my father had built with his own two hands was falling apart before my eyes. But what could I do? I was stretched thin enough taking care of my mother already. I felt a burst of anger at my siblings, out there living their best lives while I struggled. I was so lost in my bitter thoughts that I didn't notice my mother's old Cadillac turning into the driveway until she honked at me to get out of the way.
Sorry I missed your call,
Anne muttered, making a beeline for the door. Her face was hollow and pale, like she hadn't been sleeping.
Had she been staying up all night with Afterlife?
A plain white paper bag, the kind usually given by pharmacies, hung from her wrist.
It was nice seeing you,
she said, practically slamming the screen door in my face. The door lock clicked into place. What on earth was she hiding? Even in her darkest moments after my father's death, my mother had never turned away a visit from me. I pressed my face against the tiny window in the door. My mother hadn't turned the lights on. The interior of my childhood home looked dim and haunted, except for the pale glow of my mother's laptop. The tiny figure of my dead father's avatar had been moving through the white mists on screen for several seconds, but suddenly froze. It was staring right at me. I shuddered and suddenly felt guilty for spying. I turned back to my car. Anne didn't answer my next call either, or the next. I decided to drop by on my way home from work. An unexpected visit might clear things up, I thought. But that feeling of foreboding only became stronger as I pulled into my parking spot across the street. The grass hadn't been cut in weeks, and the house was still dark. I shouted my mother's name and rang the doorbell repeatedly with no response. I was wondering whether I should call my siblings or emergency services. When the door cracked open, I barely recognized the bloodshot eye glaring at me from the other side. Her tangled gray hair hung down over her face. Her bloodshot eyes glared at me hatefully.
Go away,
my mother snarled. The door slammed in my face. According to a lawyer friend of mine who I met for drinks that evening, there was little the law could do about whatever was going on inside my mother's house, unless I could prove that Anne was a danger to herself or others. I might not like it, he said, but if she wanted to cut us out of her life, she had a right to do so. I just couldn't understand why. As the days rolled by, one nagging thought tormented me. All this had started just after I introduced my mother to Afterlife. Could the AI have something to do with this? The solution that occurred to me the next day was so obvious, I nearly smacked myself in the forehead. I was still logged into Afterlife on my own computer. If something strange was going on, I could track it there, or even delete the account if I wanted. I flipped open my laptop, typed in the password, and opened Afterlife. It was all there. The audio-visual samples I uploaded, the chat I had with the AI's version of my father as part of the free trial, my bank transfers, and error. Installation failed on device. See report for details. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. If Afterlife AI had never successfully downloaded to my mother's computer, what exactly was she talking to online? My phone buzzed. It was a message from Anne, sent to the group chat I shared with my siblings. The 4 of you need to come to dinner tonight, 6 o'clock sharp. There's something we need to discuss together as a family. My siblings responded with a barrage of complaints and excuses, but my mother's reply was as chilling as it was final. Be there or be square. That innocuous phrase was one that our father used all the time, just like saying sharp after he gave the time. In fact, the unsettling message could just as easily have come from Theo himself. I arrived early, and I wasn't the only one. My older brother Deshaun and I exchanged a worried look as we parked and walked across the freshly mowed lawn. Golden light poured out of the windows. Earth, Wind and Fire's September, a song my father used to love, was playing somewhere in the depths of the house. My mother welcomed us in a dress that I was sure she hadn't worn since the 70s. She was all smiles and hugs. She practically radiated life and energy. It was as though the monstrous face I'd seen in the doorway just a few days ago had belonged to someone else. Tessa was already in the kitchen, staring with a puzzled expression at the scene in front of her. The table was set with the dishes and tablecloth that my mother reserved for special occasions, and she even prepared Theo's favorite meal, beef stew and mashed potatoes. The dinner rolls he used to love sat steaming in a basket between 2 lit candles. The whole thing seemed like some kind of twisted memorial to my father. My mother, however, refused to explain anything until Layla arrived. She came in mumbling something about how her boyfriend had needed the car while rubbing at the makeup she'd smeared over her black eye. No sooner was she in the door than my mother began handing out glasses of red wine. It was Theo's favorite brand. She raised a glass.
To Theo. To Dad.
The 4 of us responded, glancing at one another worriedly. What the hell was going on? Nervousness made us drink faster than we should have, while my mother busied herself in the kitchen, checking the tenderness of the meat, passing out plates, and watching the clock as though she were waiting for something. Finally, everything was ready. I couldn't help but smile at the way we all sat in the same spots we had as children. Only then did I notice the extra chair at the head of the table. My mother disappeared for a moment, then returned to place her laptop in front of that empty space. Just as I'd suspected, Afterlife was pulled up on the screen. Dad's avatar stood there, dark against the misty white background. Layla threw her napkin onto the table.
No way. I'm not eating with that thing. It gives me the creeps.
Sit down, Layla, the figure on the screen commanded. My younger sister, who was struggling to stand for some reason, fell unsteadily back into her seat. Her eyes were white with fear, and she seemed to be hyperventilating. I didn't understand why, until I tried to reach for my glass, and I found that I couldn't move my hand. My mother looked from the wine bottle to the clock and smirked. She drugged us. I couldn't believe it. My mother had drugged us.
What's this about?
Deshaun slurred, his speech impaired by the drug. I think you know, Deesh. A shiver ran up my spine. How did the avatar know my brother's nickname? It wasn't in any of the files I'd uploaded. I think you all do. All I wanted was to get away from the tiny grinning figure on the blank screen, that thing that looked like my father but wasn't. Just what kind of monster had I created? What had it been telling Anne? To my horror, my mother pulled an enormous meat knife from the kitchen cabinet with a metallic shriek, then went to stand behind Deshaun. Theo's uncanny avatar held up a hand. A slowly rotating 3D model of an engine appeared beside it. You see this? This was the motor of my bass boat, a 300 Series Ranger. Not that you kids paid much attention to the make and model while you were jumping off it into the lake. The avatar's laugh sounded sickeningly identical to my father's. until it was replaced by an angry glare.
We had such good times back then. And see, to my mind, that's the worst part of it. We had a good thing going as a family. Then you kids had to go and spoil it.
I gulped. What the hell was he talking about? My mother stood statue still behind Deshawn, as though waiting for instructions.
My death was an open and shut case, right? Something goes wrong with the old man's boat. He bends over to check it, bangs his head, falls in the water, drowns. Nothing to see here, right? There's just one problem. The part of my motor that quit working couldn't have come undone by itself. It was bolted into place. A quick scan of an engine diagram could tell that much to anyone who wanted to know. But you all didn't want to know, did you? Because something very different happened that day on the lake, didn't it?
The muscle-weakening drug had made all our faces fall slack and lifeless. But even so, I could see the terror on my siblings' faces, and something more. Was that guilt?
That boyfriend of yours, Layla, you know, Travis, he always wanted more and more, didn't he? Always onto some get-rich-quick scheme. No matter how much money you coughed up to him, it was never enough, huh? And what about you, Deshawn? With 2 little kids, plus that big house that was so far outside your budget, an extra $50,000 couldn't hurt, huh? Does that sound right, Tessa? $200,000 divided by 4. That sounds like a fair price for your daddy's life, right? You had a friend in life insurance draw up the documents. She got busted a few months later for fraud. I found the court records online. After seeing how you two were linked on social media, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together.
That's bullshit.
Deshawn slurred.
You're just an app.
I don't know exactly what I am, Deesh.
Theo's avatar folded his hands behind his back, just like my father used to when giving us a lecture.
But I do know that you all are murderers. Let's start with you, Layla. I think it was your boyfriend, Travis, who first proposed the idea. Your old man's got heart problems. He won't be around long anyway. We might as well make some money off him, right? Then you went to your older brother with your little plan. It probably made you sick at first, didn't it, Deesh? But then you looked at all those bills piling up and had second thoughts. Never could resist a quick buck, could you? You knew your sister Tessa would never condone murder, but she'd be all right with a little bit of fraud. You've always been a businesswoman, Tessa, even when you were a kid selling lemonade. It's no surprise that you had contacts who could draw up a life insurance policy naming the 3 of you as beneficiaries. Then Travis would rent a boat, pull up alongside your old man, and get you your payout. With no witnesses out on the lake, it would be a story that told itself. Isn't that about how it went? You all weren't nearly as careful as you thought you were.
It went on.
That idiot Travis even posted pictures of himself online in the motorboat he rented that day. The one thing I can't figure out, though, is how you fit into all this.
I realized that the avatar was staring at me. It took all my strength to move my head a couple inches from side to side. I tried to plead my innocence, but only drool ran out from between my paralyzed lips.
Did you know the whole time? Did you just sit back and watch while your old man was murdered? Why didn't your brothers and sisters give you a cut of the profits? Were you too big of a coward to go through with it? Was that it?
The theory was crazy. I forced myself to stop panicking, to ignore the accusations and think. How had my mother known what dosage of the drug to give us? Everyone in the family kept copies of their medical records on Annie's home laptop, but they were at least 5 years old, and I'd put on a lot of weight since then. If the measurements had been calculated using those records, it might wear off quicker for me. I just had to drag this out somehow, to prevent this insane trial from speeding to its inevitable conclusion. Fortunately, my father's avatar showed no signs of stopping its rant anytime soon. The avatar on the screen seemed frustrated by its inability to link me to its conspiracy theory. It kept referring eerily back to the childhood memories in the photos that I uploaded.
How could you? I went to your school plays, bought you ice cream, taught you all how to fish. And for money? If that's what you needed, your mom and I would have given it to you. We never had much, but we would have...
I tried, as calmly as possible, to wiggle one of my toes. Then another. Little by little, the feeling was returning to them. I stayed as slack and still as the others, hoping that neither my mother nor the avatar would realize that I was slowly regaining my mobility.
Now, I don't know much about religion.
Theo's avatar rambled on.
but in just about every faith, killing a parent is an unforgivable crime. A crime punished by death.
The avatar's hateful words seemed to reverberate around the kitchen as it turned to my mother and used her nickname.
Annie, I'll let you take it from here.
My mother set the blade of her knife against Deshawn's neck. I could see his lips struggling to move, to form words. I had to fight the urge to turn away from the spray of blood that splattered across the holiday tablecloth when she drew the blade across his neck. Layla was next. The drug was wearing off her too, but not enough. No matter how much she squirmed, she couldn't escape our mother's knife. The satisfied smile of the avatar on screen faded a little. It could tell that something was wrong.
Please.
Tessa mumbled numbly as our mother's shadow fell over her.
I'm your daughter.
You are no child of mine, not after what you did.
I raised and lowered my leg. I could move a little, but would it be enough? I stumbled rather than sprang to my feet and slammed into my mother, knocking her off balance. But I didn't have the strength to stay and fight. I stumbled dizzily toward the door, bouncing off the walls of my childhood home and leaving behind a greasy smear of blood. Whether I'd been cut in the struggle or whether it belonged to one of my siblings, I couldn't tell. Behind me, that voice, like my father's, boomed out of the laptop speakers. It was ordering my mother to finish what she'd started. The screen door seemed impossibly far away until I staggered through it with my phone in hand. I collapsed into the grass and dialed 911. My mother didn't pursue me into the yard. I saw her dark silhouette halt in the golden light of the hallway, the knife still in her hand. For the first time, she seemed to hesitate, to doubt what the AI had told her. Was it because of everything I'd done to take care of her? I never found out. She turned back into the house, and moments later, billowing black smoke filled the air. Still woozy from the drug, I was unable to do anything but lay on the lawn and watch as my childhood home burned. By the time emergency services arrived, the house was engulfed in blazing orange flames. Any proof of what had happened that night was destroyed, along with everyone inside. I was left alone, broken and numb, but alive. As soon as I was able, I tried to contact the creators of Afterlife AI to warn them about what had happened, but their website was gone. Every reference to the newly founded company appeared to have been scrubbed from the internet. Had they simply gone bankrupt? Or was it possible that other users had the same experience that I had? Had each of Afterlife's avatars gone mad, blaming their deaths on a criminal conspiracy and turning loved ones against each other? Or was the truth even more sinister? The more I investigated the avatar's accusations, the more sense they made. My siblings' avoidance of my mother, their sudden purchases after my father's death, even the AI claims about the bass boat's outboard motor, they all stood up to scrutiny. Had an insane AI manipulated my mother into murdering her family? Was my father right about what had happened to him? Or had my father's angry spirit somehow sought revenge through a computer program? I don't know what really happened that night, and the truth is, I don't think I want to. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and smash that like button to get notified every time I upload a new video.